What if the American Revolution was saved, not once, but 3 times, by a man you have never heard of? Not a founding father, not a famous general, a fisherman from a tiny town in Massachusetts. On the night of August 29, 1776, the American Revolution was about 9,000 men away from being over. An entire army was trapped on the wrong side of a river. A victorious British force in front of them, and a mile of cold black water at their backs. If those soldiers were captured, there would be no one left to fight. The war would likely end before it began. By sunrise, every one of the men was gone, vanished. When British scouts crept forward, they found the trenches empty. They could not believe what they were looking at. The man who pulled off that escape, and who would go on to save the army again and again, was not a famous general. He was a fisherman from a small town in Massachusetts. His name was John Glover. And this is the story your history class skipped. To understand John Glover, you have to understand Marblehead. Marblehead was a fishing town perched on the rocky coast north of Boston. It had no grand farms and no easy living. What it had was the sea. Generation after generation of Marblehead men sailed out to the cod banks of the North Atlantic, some of the most unforgiving waters on Earth. They learned to handle small boats in storms that would terrify a trained navy, and to row in the dark, in ice and in fog, with their lives depending on it. John Glover was born in 1732 and came up the hard way, starting with nothing and building himself into a successful merchant and ship owner, part of what locals called the codfish aristocracy. He was practical, blunt, and respected, and when the war came, the men of Marblehead followed him. And here is something remarkable about the regiment he raised. By the unit's own records, roughly 1 in 5 of these men were not white. Black and Native American sailors served shoulder to shoulder with white fishermen, along with men of mixed heritage and at least one Jewish soldier. On the open ocean, a crew survives or drowns together, and skill matters more than skin. It may have been the most integrated fighting force in the entire Continental Army. Washington would later call them men bred to the sea. The Army gave them a nickname that stuck: the Amphibious Regiment. Before he ever rescued an army, Glover gave the Revolution something it desperately lacked: a navy. In the late summer of 1775, George Washington was laying siege to British-held Boston, and he needed to choke off the supply ships feeding the enemy. He had no warships at all. So he turned to Glover, who owned a fast schooner named the Hannah, after Glover's own wife. The Hannah was fitted with guns, crewed by Glover's Marblehead men, and sent out to hunt. She is often remembered as the first armed vessel to sail under American command, the small wooden seed of what would become the United States Navy. Within days, she captured an enemy supply ship. It was a sign of things to come. When the cause needed something done on the water, the answer kept coming back to the same fisherman. Now back to that desperate night. In the summer of 1776, Britain sent the largest invasion force in its history across the Atlantic to crush the rebellion in New York. On August 27th, the two armies clashed in the Battle of Long Island, also called the Battle of Brooklyn. It was a disaster for the Americans. Washington was outflanked and beaten badly, and his army was driven back onto Brooklyn Heights, and there they were trapped. The British army sat in front of them. The wide East River sat behind them. All the enemy had to do was sail warships up that river, and Washington's army, and the revolution with it, would be finished. Washington made a stunning decision. He would evacuate the entire army across the river in the dark, in secret, right under the enemy's nose. The job went to John Glover and his Marblehead Mariners, joined by sailors from nearby Salem. All through the night, the fishermen worked. They packed thousands of soldiers into small boats and rowed them across the black water, then went back for more, trip after trip after trip, moving men, horses, and cannon. Two things saved them. A hard wind from the northeast had kept the British warships from sailing up the river, and as dawn threatened to expose everything, a thick fog rolled in and hid the crossing completely. When morning came, about 9,000 men had crossed to safety. The army was intact, the cannon were saved, and by tradition, George Washington himself was among the very last to step into a boat and leave the shore. The British advanced into the American lines and found nothing but mud and abandoned campfires. An entire army had slipped through their fingers. Some have called it America's Dunkirk. It happened because a group of fishermen could do the one thing no one else could. A few weeks later, Glover proved he was more than a man with a boat. He could fight. In October of 1776, the British tried to land a large force at a place called Pell's Point, in what is now the Bronx, hoping to swing around behind Washington and trap him once more. Glover spotted the danger with only about 750 men under his command. He was outnumbered several times over, so he used the land like a sailor reads the sea. He hid his men behind the long stone walls that lined the road, in staggered rows. One group fired into the advancing British, then fell back. Then the next rose up and fired. Then the next. Wave after wave, they bled the British advance and slowed it to a crawl. Glover's small band held off a much larger force for an entire day and bought Washington the time he needed to move his army to safer ground at White Plains. It was one of the most skillful delaying actions of the whole war, and almost no one has heard of it. You have seen the painting. Washington standing tall in a boat, crossing an icy river. It is one of the most famous images in American history. But look closely and ask the question almost no one asks. Who is actually rowing that boat? The answer is the Marblehead Mariners. By the end of 1776, the Revolution was dying. The army had been beaten and chased across New Jersey, and soldiers were freezing, starving, and going home as their enlistments ran out. Washington needed a victory, or there would be no army left. So on Christmas night, he gambled everything on a surprise attack across the Delaware River. The river was choked with ice, and a brutal winter storm was blowing snow and freezing rain. Once again, it was Glover's fishermen at the oars. They guided heavy wooden boats loaded with soldiers, cannon, and horses through the dark and the ice, and delivered roughly 2,400 men to the far bank without losing them. At dawn, the army marched on Trenton and crushed the surprised garrison there. It was the victory the cause needed. It convinced wavering soldiers to stay, convinced the country the war could still be won, and breathed life back into the Revolution at the exact moment it was about to flicker out. None of it happens if the men at the oars fail. So why don't we know his name? Part of the answer is that the moment passed quickly. Soon after Trenton, the enlistments of the Marblehead men expired, and the famous regiment broke up. Many of the fishermen went off to serve on privateer ships at sea. Glover himself went home for a time, worn down and facing money troubles and sickness in his family. He came back. He was promoted to general and served through the rest of the war, including the campaign that captured an entire British army at Saratoga, a turning point that helped bring France into the war on America's side. When the fighting was over, John Glover simply went home to Marblehead, to the sea and the town that made him. He died there in 1797. He never wrote himself into legend. He was a fisherman who did the impossible several times, and then quietly returned to his ordinary life. But think about what he and his men actually did. They saved the army at Brooklyn. They shielded it at Pell's Point. They carried it across the Delaware to Trenton. Take away any one of those nights, and the story of the United States might have ended right there in the cold and the fog. The American Revolution was not won by famous names alone. Sometimes it was saved by a few hundred fishermen rowing in the dark, asking for no credit at all. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the heroes who shaped history and then disappeared from it, like and subscribe and stick around. Because the textbooks left a lot out. Thanks for watching.